The water was black, not dark brown the way swamp water usually looks when the afternoon light catches it just right, when the tannins turn it the color of old tea, and you can almost convince yourself it is beautiful. No, this water was black, the kind of black that does not let you see what is beneath it, the kind of black that swallows light whole and gives nothing back. And I was running through it, not jogging, not wading with careful steps, and a long stick, testing depth the way experienced trackers move through bottomland. Running. Because something behind me had moved in the cattails, and before my brain had even processed the sound, my legs had already made the decision for me. That is the thing about the swamp nobody tells you before you go in for the first time. Your body will make decisions without you. Your conscious mind will still be turning over possibilities, still be saying to itself, it was probably just a bird, probably a nutria, probably the wind across the reed bed, while your legs are already at full sprint through ankle-deep water that grabs at every step. If you have never been afraid like that, genuinely, physically afraid, the kind of afraid where your vision tunnels and your hearing sharpens into something almost supernatural, you might not understand what I am about to describe. But if you have felt it even once, you will know exactly what I am talking about. You will know it the way you know the smell of rain before it arrives. Stay with me through this whole story, because it only gets worse. And if you want more stories like this one, stories where the wilderness makes it absolutely clear that you are not at the top of this particular food chain, then subscribe right now. There are people who have survived things in these swamps and wild places that you would not believe were possible, and we tell all of those stories here. So let me take you back to the beginning. Let me take you back to the moment before I was running, before I was afraid, to the point where I was still confident, still comfortable, still the kind of foolish that passes for brave, when you have not yet been shown what you do not know. I had been coming to this particular stretch of coastal marsh in the southeastern United States for 3 years. 3 seasons of early mornings and late afternoons, of learning the patterns of the place, of watching the way the water moved through the cuts in the sawgrass, of tracking the subtle shifts in bird behavior that told you what was happening below the surface. I knew this marsh, or I believed I did, which is a very different thing, and the marsh had been patient with me. It had allowed me to walk its edges and wade its shallows and feel like I understood it. That patience, as it turned out, had an expiration date. It had been a dry spring, the kind of dry that concentrates everything, that draws down the water table and pushes every animal toward the remaining pools and channels. When water is everywhere, animals spread out. When water becomes scarce, they gather. And what gathers in these marshes when the water levels drop and the prey fish crowd into the remaining holes is something that has not meaningfully changed since the Cretaceous period. Something that has survived every catastrophe this planet has thrown at it. Every mass extinction, every ice age, every continental rearrangement. Something that was here long before we were, and will, in all probability, be here long after we are gone. American alligators are not simply large reptiles. That is the mistake most people make when they try to understand them, when they try to calculate the risk and come up with what seems like a reasonable assessment. They look at the size, they look at the sluggishness on the bank, they look at the way an alligator lies in the sun with its mouth open and its eyes half closed, and they think they understand what they are dealing with. They do not. What they are seeing is not laziness, it is efficiency. An alligator at rest is not sleeping through its life the way a house cat sleeps through its afternoons. It is conserving. It is banking energy with a precision that no warm-blooded animal can match, because it does not have to spend that energy keeping its core temperature stable. Every calorie an alligator takes in goes toward growth and reproduction and the explosive, violent, almost incomprehensible speed it can produce when the moment comes. And the moment always comes. I had entered the marsh at the old hunting access point on the western edge, where a 2-track dirt road ends at a rusted cattle gate, and the ground transitions from pine flatwood to the soft, uncertain substrate of the marsh edge. I had made this walk perhaps 40 times. I knew where the ground was solid and where it would give way under my boots, where the sawgrass was thin enough to push through, and where it formed walls too dense to penetrate without a machete. I knew the locations of 3 active alligator nests from the previous summer, but 2 of those had been on the far eastern edge of the marsh, a half-mile from where I would be working today, and the third had been in a section of dense bulrush that I had no intention of entering. The plan was straightforward. I was documenting wading bird activity in the larger open water sections, specifically a population of roseate spoonbills that had been using a particular shallow flat for the past 2 weeks. Spoonbills are not subtle. They are the color of watermelon flesh, and they move through the shallows with a side-to-side sweeping motion, their spatulate bills swinging through the water like metal detectors. You can see them from a distance, which was the point. I did not need to get close. I had a spotting scope and a notebook, and the plan was to sit at the edge of a natural levee, elevated perhaps 18 inches above the surrounding marsh, and watch from there. I was 40 minutes in when I found the route. Or rather, when the route found me. The levee trail was overgrown from the dry spring, the vegetation having pushed inward from both sides to fill the path that foot traffic usually kept clear. I had been watching a great egret working the shallows to my left, that slow, deliberate stalking walk that looks almost like patience made physical, and I had turned my head to track it just as my right foot came down in exactly the wrong place. The root was old cypress, bleached silver by years of exposure, and it ran across the path at an angle, maybe 4 inches above the ground surface. In good light, looking directly at the path, I would have stepped over it without thinking. But I was not looking at the path, and the filtered afternoon light through the buttonbush canopy overhead had reduced it to near invisibility. My foot caught the root at mid-arch. My momentum, which was already carrying me slightly to the left toward the edge of the levee, now had an assist. I felt the familiar nauseating lurch of a fall beginning, the fraction of a second where your body has already lost the argument with gravity, but your brain has not yet accepted the outcome. My arms went out. The spotting scope, which I had been carrying on its travel tripod over my right shoulder, swung forward. I tried to correct, to shift my weight back, and the shift was slightly too aggressive. I went down hard on my right knee, catching myself with both hands, and the impact drove me forward off the edge of the levee into the shallow water below. The water was perhaps 8 inches deep. The bottom was soft organic mud, the kind that has accumulated over centuries of decaying plant matter, and my hands sank into it to the wrists. I was face down in the shallows, dazed, trying to process what had just happened, trying to inventory damage. Right knee, burning, probably torn something. Hands submerged in mud, no major pain. The scope, I had let it go in the fall, and I could see it had landed a few feet away in the water. The tripod legs pointed skyward, like a capsized crab. I pushed myself up onto my knees, and I looked up. The alligator was already in the air. I want to be precise about this, because in the years since, people have questioned it, have suggested that what I saw must have been the beginning of a lunge from a stationary position, must have been something I reconstructed afterward in the shock and adrenaline of the moment. But I know what I saw, and I have since spoken with enough herpetologists and wildlife biologists who have told me that what I described is entirely consistent with documented alligator behavior. Specifically, the explosive launch from partial submersion that researchers have filmed at speeds that seem physically impossible for an animal of that mass. It was a large animal. I cannot give you an exact measurement because I was not in a position to be precise, but I have spent enough time in these marshes to make reasonable estimates, and this animal was between 10 and 11 feet long. It was female, almost certainly, given the nesting season and the location, which I understood only later. It was already committed to the attack before I had fully registered its presence. I think I screamed. I am not certain of this. What I am certain of is that I moved. The fall that had put me into the water now, paradoxically, may have been what saved me, because the trajectory of the animal's launch was calibrated for something on the levee edge, something upright, something at the height I had been before I went over. The bite came down where my upper body should have been, and found instead the aluminum tube of the spotting scope tripod. The sound of an alligator bite is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It is not the sound you expect. People expect a snap, something sharp and quick, the way you imagine a large trap closing. What it actually sounds like is more like a collision, a dense, wet, percussive impact, the sound of enormous force meeting resistance. The tripod did not survive the encounter. I was already scrambling. Not running yet, because I was still in the water, still on hands and knees in the mud, still trying to get my legs under me. The alligator recovered from the lunge with a speed that still seems impossible to me, that rollback and reset that speaks to a nervous system refined over 100 million years for exactly this purpose. I got my feet under me and I ran. There are things I remember clearly about those next 30 seconds, and things that are simply gone, overwritten by the intensity of what my body was experiencing. I remember the sawgrass cutting my forearms as I pushed through a stand of it at the levee edge. I remember the sound of water being displaced behind me, a sound that I will not try to describe because I do not have the words for it, and any words I chose would fall short. I remember reaching the two-track road and continuing to run without slowing, without looking back, for another 200 yards before my legs simply stopped working properly, and I went down against a slash pine at the road edge and stayed there for what felt like a very long time. The alligator did not follow me onto the road. They rarely do. This is important to understand, not as a comfort, because that experience was beyond comforting, but as context. Alligators are ambush predators, and they are supremely confident in their element, in the water and at its edge, and they are correspondingly less committed once prey has reached dry ground. The pursuit behavior I experienced in those 30 seconds in the water and at the marsh edge is genuine and documented, but it typically does not extend far onto land. This is not a rule, this is a tendency, and it is absolutely not a basis for complacency. What happened to me that afternoon was the result of a specific convergence of factors, each one of which I should have understood better than I did, and the combination of which created a situation that came within the width of an aluminum tripod leg of ending very differently. Let me walk through them, not as a confession, though there is something confessional about it, but because the details matter, because the details are what save lives. The drought conditions had concentrated both prey and predators into smaller areas of open water. I knew this intellectually, but had not fully adjusted my behavior to account for it. In normal water conditions, the stretch of marsh I was working would have been low-density alligator habitat. In drought conditions, it had become something very different, and I had not recalibrated. The time of day was wrong. Late afternoon and late spring is peak activity time for alligators in this region. They have been warming in the midday sun, and they are now at their most metabolically active, which means they are hunting. I knew this. I had known this for 3 years, and I had been so comfortable in this particular marsh that I had allowed comfort to displace caution in a way that is almost embarrassingly predictable in hindsight. There was a nest nearby. I found it 3 days later, when I returned with a biologist colleague, found it tucked into a bulrush mat approximately 40 feet from the point of the attack. A female alligator guarding a nest is a categorically different threat level from any other alligator you might encounter. The eggs are everything. The eggs represent the entire biological purpose of that animal's existence, and she will defend them with a commitment and a ferocity that has no upper limit. I had walked into her perimeter without knowing it was her perimeter, and I had fallen into her water. The fall itself was perhaps the strangest element of all, because the fall might have been what saved me. The trajectory of her launch was not aligned with where I ended up. Had I remained upright, had I simply stumbled and caught myself on the levee edge, or had I fallen more cleanly into the water in an upright position, the outcome might have been different. The chaotic nature of the fall, the way it sent me sprawling forward and low and forward at an odd angle, put me out of the center of her strike zone at the critical moment. I am not saying luck is a strategy. I am saying that sometimes the universe makes a decision for you, and you learn to live with the fact that it could just as easily have gone the other way. In the weeks after, I spent a great deal of time with the biology of what I had witnessed, reading everything I could find, talking to researchers who had spent careers studying these animals. And what emerged from those conversations was a picture of a predator so precisely engineered for its purpose that it becomes difficult to think of it in ordinary wildlife terms. It belongs in a different category, the way certain things in the natural world belong in a different category, the way deep ocean trenches and hurricane eye walls belong in a different category. Not simply dangerous, fundamental, a thing that predates human consciousness itself and will continue long after our particular experiment is over. American alligators can grow to more than 14 feet in length and can weigh over 1,000 pounds. The bite force of a large adult has been measured at nearly 3,000 pounds per square inch, which is not the strongest bite in the animal kingdom, but is sufficient to crush the leg bones of an adult cow without appreciable effort. They can run on land at speeds approaching 11 miles per hour for short distances, which is faster than most people can react, and in water they are simply in a different world, propelled by a tail that can generate force that has to be seen to be believed. They are extraordinarily sensitive to vibration. They can detect the pressure waves produced by a struggling animal in the water from remarkable distances. They do not miss much. And yet they are also, in the right context, genuinely extraordinary animals to observe. This is the tension that I have never been able to resolve, not in 3 years of marsh work before the attack and not in the years since, because the alligator is not a villain. It is not a monster in any useful sense of the word. It is an apex predator doing what apex predators do, and it does it with a perfection that is, if you can find the emotional distance to appreciate it, almost beautiful. Alligators play a role in the ecology of these southeastern wetlands that is difficult to overstate. They are the engineers of the system. In dry periods, exactly the kind of conditions I was experiencing that day, they excavate depressions in the marsh floor with their bodies and tails, creating what biologists call gator holes, areas of permanent open water that persist through droughts and serve as refugia for fish, amphibians, invertebrates, and the birds that feed on them. Without alligators, these systems would change profoundly. The productivity of the entire wetland complex depends, to a significant degree, on these animals' willingness to dig. They are also, counterintuitively, important to the nesting success of many wading bird species. Herons and egrets and spoonbills will actively nest in trees and shrubs directly above alligator territories because the alligator's presence deters raccoons and other mammalian nest predators. It is a relationship of mutual benefit that has developed over millions of years and that functions with a precision that no wildlife manager could design. The birds get protection from nest predation. The alligators get an occasional chick that falls from the nest above them. Everything is connected. Everything is arranged. I thought about all of this, lying against that slash pine at the road edge, with my heart still hammering and my knee beginning to stiffen and the mud drying on my forearms. I thought about the nest I had not known was there, about the eggs she was defending, about the fact that from her perspective I had been a legitimate threat materializing out of nowhere in her territory, and that her response had been entirely proportionate to that threat. She had not been cruel, she had been precise. It did not make me feel better, but it made me feel something, some complicated mixture of residual terror and genuine respect that I have not found a single word for and have stopped trying to reduce to one. 3 days later, as I mentioned, I went back in with my colleague Sarah, who has spent the better part of 2 decades studying alligator behavior in these wetland systems. We went in the morning, when activity levels are lower. We went in a group of 4 people, which changes the risk calculus significantly. And we went with the kind of attention to the water surface and the vegetation edges that I had clearly not been exercising on the afternoon of the incident. Sarah found the nest without much difficulty. It was a mound of decomposing vegetation and mud, roughly 4 feet high and perhaps 8 feet in diameter at the base, tucked into a stand of bulrush that offered nearly complete visual concealment from the levee. She estimated the nest was perhaps 2 weeks from hatching, which meant the female was in the highest state of defensive alertness she would reach during the entire nesting cycle. The weeks immediately before hatching, when the mother begins to hear the soft vocalizations of the hatchlings inside the eggs, when she is waiting for the moment she will open the nest and carry the babies to the water in her mouth, those are the weeks when she is most dangerous. I had walked into the territory of a large female alligator guarding a nest 2 weeks from hatching, during afternoon peak activity hours in drought conditions. Every variable had been stacked against me, and the only thing that had gone in my favor was a cypress root and a bad step. Sarah looked at the damaged vegetation at the levee edge where I had gone over, looked at the disturbed mud in the shallows where the animal had launched, and was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that what I had described, the fact that the animal was already committed to the strike before I had fully registered its presence, was consistent with behavior she had documented in similarly stressed females in previous seasons. The trigger for the attack, she believed, had not been my fall into the water. It had been my approach along the levee, the vibrations of my footsteps transmitted through the saturated soil into the water column, picked up by mechanoreceptors along the animal's jaw and body. She had known I was coming before I knew she was there. Let that settle for a moment. She had been tracking my approach through the vibrations of my footsteps in the mud. She had been positioning herself as I walked the levee, and when I went over the edge and into the water, she was already aligned for the strike. The thought that stays with me, the one I cannot walk away from, no matter how many times I turn it over, is the question of how many other times something like this has been happening just out of my awareness. How many times in 3 years of marsh work had some large animal been tracking my approach through vibration, had been aware of me long before I was aware of it, had made some calculation and decided I was not worth the energy, had let me pass? How many mornings had I been standing at the edge of open water and had been, in some animal's sensory world, entirely visible and entirely assessed, while I peered at bird activity through my spotting scope and congratulated myself on how well I knew this place. The marsh does not reveal all of its contents at once. It shows you what it chooses to show you, and it keeps the rest for itself. The recovery took longer than I expected. The knee was a partial tear of the medial meniscus, which required 3 months of physical therapy and a period of genuine uncertainty about whether I would have full function back. There was no bite wound, which I feel I need to state clearly because people assume there was, because the story seems incomplete without one. The strike hit the tripod, not me. The tripod was titanium-reinforced aluminum, rated for a 30-pound payload, and it was destroyed. That is the only context in which I allow myself to think about what the impact would have been if the trajectory had been 2 feet different. There were nights in those early weeks, lying with my leg elevated and the knee swollen to something that did not resemble my knee, when I would wake from dreams I did not remember, with a heart rate that I could feel in my ears, and a certainty, profound and physical and completely irrational, that there was dark water somewhere in the room. That kind of fear does not resolve the way a broken bone resolves, with clear stages and a timeline and eventual completeness. It settles into you differently. It becomes part of the background. I went back to the marsh for the first time 4 months after the incident. Sarah came with me. We entered at a different access point, worked a different section of the system, and I was conscious throughout of a vigilance that was new, that was exhausting, in a way that the old comfortable version of being in the marsh had never been. Every disturbance in the water at the periphery of my vision demanded attention. Every sound from the vegetation at the water's edge required assessment before I could move on. My body had learned something that my conscious mind was still negotiating, and those two processes ran in parallel for months. I saw 3 alligators that day from safe distances and appropriate sight lines, including one large female in the eastern section that Sarah estimated at 9 feet, sunning on a mud bank with the absolute stillness of a thing that has never needed to hurry. I watched her through binoculars for 20 minutes. She did not move. She was aware of us, certainly, in whatever sensory way alligators maintain awareness of their environment, but she had made the calculation that we did not represent a threat or an opportunity, and she was conserving, banking energy with that extraordinary efficiency that belongs to a lineage 240 million years deep. I felt, watching her, something close to gratitude. Not for the experience in any sentimental sense, not in the way people sometimes describe near-death experiences as gifts, which has always struck me as a self-serving reframing of what is fundamentally just bad luck, but gratitude for the clarity, for the absolute, unmistakable communication from the natural world that I had not, in fact, understood this place as well as I had thought I did, that there was more to know, that there would always be more to know, and that the appropriate response to that fact was not fear, exactly, but something more like respect, something more like attention, because attention is what these systems demand and what they reward. The marsh does not punish carelessness the way it might seem to from the outside. What it does is simply exist, exactly as it has always existed, with the same rules and the same relationships and the same ancient calculus of predator and prey and energy and season, and when you move through it without sufficient attention, you do not violate its rules. You simply become subject to them in a way that makes their nature very clear. I want to talk about the broader picture for a moment, about what the presence of apex predators like alligators means for the health and function of these wetland systems, because it is something I had understood intellectually before my incident, and understood physically, viscerally, incomparably better after it. When you have been in the water with one of these animals in a context where the ancient math of predation was being seriously calculated, you understand the alligator's role in these systems from the inside out, not as an abstraction. The southeastern United States holds the largest population of American alligators in the world, something in the range of 5 million animals distributed across the coastal plain wetlands from North Carolina to Texas. This population was not always so robust. By the middle of the 20th century, decades of unregulated hunting for hides and a market that paid well for alligator leather had driven the species to the edge of what scientists cautiously called threatened status. In some parts of their range, populations had collapsed so severely that the ecological effects were becoming visible. The gator holes were not being maintained. The wading bird nesting success was declining. The fine-tuned relationships built over millions of years were beginning to fray. The legal protections that followed, culminating in full federal protection under the Endangered Species Act in the 1970s, produced one of the most dramatic recoveries in North American wildlife history. The alligator responded to protection the way a species that has been here for 240 million years responds to a temporary setback, with an efficiency and resilience that made wildlife managers look rather better than their initial models had predicted. Within 2 decades, the population had rebounded substantially. Within 30 years, the species had been moved from threatened status to a position stable enough to allow limited regulated harvest in several states. Today, the alligator population is, by most measures, healthy. And the wetland systems that depend on alligators are, in those places where the habitat itself has been preserved, healthy with them. This is the argument that the conservationists and the biologists make, and it is an argument that my own body now has a very strong and specifically located opinion about. The value of keeping apex predators in their systems is not sentimental, it is functional. These animals are not preserved because they are beautiful, though some of them are, in that severe and specific way that functional things can be beautiful. They are preserved because removing them changes everything downstream in ways that are difficult to predict and even more difficult to reverse. An alligator excavating a gator hole in a drought is performing a service for every fish and frog and wading bird in that section of marsh. A female alligator guarding her nest is, from 300 feet away, and with binoculars and the right state of mind, an extraordinary thing to observe. She is attending to something as old as attention itself. She is part of a lineage that watched the dinosaurs come and go, that survived the asteroid, that navigated the ice ages, that was here, in these coastal marshes when this coastline had a different shape, and the sea level stood in a different place, and that will, barring catastrophes we cannot yet imagine, be here when our own tenure on this continent is a geological footnote. I find this clarifying rather than diminishing. The fact that I nearly became a data point in that story, rather than a witness to it, has made me a more careful witness, a more attentive one. Someone who checks the water surface differently now, who reads the behavior of wading birds differently, because he knows that their sudden vertical departure from a section of shallows is information, that the information has been encoded in their nervous systems by millions of years of being prey in the same system where alligators are predators. The spoonbills were back the following spring, on the same shallow flat where I had been heading on the afternoon of the incident. I sat on the levee, in daylight, with good sight lines, and watched them for 2 hours. They are extraordinary animals, the spoonbills, with that peculiar sweeping feeding motion, and that color that seems wrong for a bird, too vivid, too tropical, like something that belongs in a reef rather than a marsh. Watching them work the flat, I thought about all of it, about the root and the fall and the dark water and the sound that I still do not have words for, about the nest I had not known was there and the female I had not known was tracking me, about the titanium tripod that is now in a landfill somewhere and will be there for a very long time. I thought about the fact that in the context of this marsh, in the context of this system, the events of that afternoon were utterly unremarkable. A large female alligator defended her nest. An animal that did not belong in her water ended up in her water. She responded. Everything worked exactly the way it has always worked, the way it worked before there were people to have opinions about it. And I walked away, which was luck, and which was the tripod, and which was the route that sent me sideways, at exactly the moment her trajectory was fixed. There is a version of that afternoon where the story ends differently. I know this, the way I know the smell of the marsh, the way I know the sound of red-winged blackbirds in the cattails on a spring morning, which is to say completely, and without any distance from it. The version where the story ends differently does not keep me from going back. But it keeps me from going back the way I used to go, with that comfortable assumption of familiarity, that dangerous ease that passes for knowledge when you have not yet been shown the limits of what you know. Every time I enter the marsh now, I enter it as what I actually am, a visitor. A warm-blooded, essentially defenseless, largely ignorant visitor, moving through a system that was ancient before my species had language, that operates according to rules that were written long before there were minds to understand them, and that extends its occasional tolerance to careful, attentive, appropriately humble guests. I try to be that. I do not always succeed, but I try. The root is still there as far as I know, bleached silver and running